So adenoids are actually pharyngeal tonsils. Palatines, say ah, and you can see those. Linguals, you'd have to stick out your tongue really far to see them at the very base of the tongue. So 3 sets of tonsils here. I think what they do nowadays is the tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy. The tonsillectomy takes the palatines out. The adenoidectomy takes out the pharyngeal tonsils, so it's both I think they take.
Do they take the lingual tonsils?
I've never heard of them taking the linguals. I mean, I assume they probably could if they needed to, but the only ones I hear about are the palatines and the pharyngeal. And as you probably know, those things can swell. If you get repeated infections, they can produce scar tissue, so they become less effective at doing their job. And then, of course, they can also swell to the point of making it difficult to breathe or swallow, which affects issues day and night when you're sleeping. So, yeah, back in the day, that used to be what everybody had done, was had their tonsils removed, because they didn't really think that tonsils were all that useful. But now they find that leaving them in and treating them is probably better than having them removed. Anybody had them out as an adult?
30 years old.
How awful was that?
Terrible.
I've heard that as a kid, if you're 6, you're 8 years old, it's not a problem to have them removed. As an adult, your glossopharyngeal nerve, and I believe it's the vagus, run right behind where those palatines sit. And then you've got the carotid artery and all those blood vessels sitting right in that wall as well. So the bleeding and the pain is excruciating because you've got nerves and blood vessels sitting right so close to that area. So yeah, they say as an adult that's just the worst thing.
But they were that big, so they had no choice.
So you'd be like, okay, take them.
I was much better without them. It was worth it.
More dangerous for an adult.
Very dangerous for an adult, yeah.
Pretty much grounded.
Uh-huh. Almost check on the blood from the...
And it was all taped in there.
Oh my
They had
God.
that tube down in there, my throat. So when I woke up, it was just taped in there.
How awful.
I don't know what to do.
They say for kids it's just, in and out. For adults it's just horrible. It sounds like that was for you. Yeah. I've heard people have died from them, so, those removals, so dangerous things. Okay, so we've got nasopharynx taken care of. That's home to your station tube and your adenoids. Adenoids are also called pharyngeal tonsils. Let's move a little down into the oropharynx. Let me go back and show you the colored picture here. Oropharynx is essentially the back part of your mouth. If you look in the mirror and see straight back to the pharynx wall, that region back beyond your tongue is the oropharynx region. So essentially it's congruous with your oral cavity, or same as your oral cavity, back in the back portion. Alright, so the oropharynx is actually home to your palatine tonsils and your lingual tonsils. They're more associated with your mouth area, while adenoids are more associated with that nasopharynx region. Keep track here. Up in the nasopharynx, we're just conducting air. Move down here into the oropharynx, not just air anymore, but also food. By the time you get down low here toward the laryngopharynx, let's go back and take a look at this previous picture. Your body now makes the decision on how to route this stuff. Of course, if it's air, it travels through our anterior tube known as the trachea, and if it's food, the trachea is closed off by the epiglottis, and the food is routed through the posterior tube known as what?
Esophagus.
Esophagus, good. So the laryngopharynx is where your body decides how to route air and food, either to the anterior or posterior tubes there. All right, any tonsils in laryngopharynx? Nah. Tonsils are in nasopharynx, and palatine and lingual tonsils are in oropharynx. So by the time you reach that laryngopharynx, there's no tonsils down in that region. The larynx is our next organ of the respiratory pathway, so let's take a look here. So you've probably seen something that looks exactly like this in lab. These respiratory models usually have the lungs, and then they have that piece that comes off for the larynx. Alright, so let's see what we've got. First thing you'll notice here is at the very top you've got the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is the only bone in the body that does not what?
Touch another?
Touch another, yeah. So it's kind of an oddball in the fact that it does not articulate or touch another bone. What is it useful for then? Why do we have it? What's that?
Speech?
Swallowing.
Swallowing?
Swallowing, yeah. It's part of the swallowing mechanism. So at the very top of your throat here, you're going to notice that you have the hyoid bone. It's probably pretty hard to feel, but it does sit at the very top of your trachea here, that larynx structure, so it's actually involved in the swallowing mechanism. Right beneath it, you'll notice this shield-shaped piece of cartilage known as the thyroid cartilage. In males, that becomes enlarged and we call it an Adam's apple. But both males and females do have that thyroid cartilage. Sitting inferior to it, you'll notice a smaller piece of cartilage known as cricoid cartilage. And of course, in the same general area, we're going to have the thyroid gland wrapped around the trachea. Beyond the cricoid cartilage going inferior here, you'll notice that we run into a set of C rings. These C-shaped rings are actually part of the trachea, and they help to keep it open. Why aren't these rings O-rings that travel all the way around that trachea?
So like, kind of like food through.
Food, yeah. Expand behind there because posterior to your trachea sits what?
Esophagus.
Esophagus. So you have C-shaped rings for the trachea because behind it you're going to be swallowing food. So if you swallow a big piece of food, it can actually use the back part of your trachea to expand into that area. So that's why we don't have O-rings on the trachea, but just C-shaped rings, front and side, are lined with cartilage. In this picture, you can see how the thyroid cartilage is situated. They label it right here. Cricoid wraps all the way around. You can see it's labeled on both back. They didn't show it to us here on the front, but cricoid cartilage does wrap all the way around the trachea, whereas thyroid cartilage is a shield on the front. As we move further down, now we're going to get into the trachea, but let's pause and talk about some of those internal structures of the larynx first. All right. Run a camera down into the throat here. You'll notice that we have an opening between the vocal cords. That opening is called the glottis. So the glottis is lined on either side here with mucous membranes known as vocal folds or vocal cords. So as you know, those things vibrate to produce speech for us, and inflammation of those vocal cords produces what? Laryngitis, exactly. So we rely on those mucous membranes to essentially produce sounds for us. One thing you might notice here is it looks to be a flap sticking around here. What is the name of that flap?
Epiglottis.
Epiglottis, good. So here's another orientation. They flipped it on this picture. You can see the epiglottis is almost like a trash can lid. When you swallow, that epiglottis rises up. It caps off the opening to the glottis, prevents food or water from traveling down into your respiratory passageway. And when you're through swallowing, it'll slide back down and remain open. So if you put your hand on your throat and swallow, you'll feel that whole larynx mechanism slide up as you swallow and then right back down. And that's because the epiglottis is capping off the trachea and then going back into place. Do you recall what kind of tissue forms that epiglottis?
Simple columnar?
It's cartilage, I'll give you that. It's not hyaline, E for ear, and E for elastic. There you go. So elastic cartilage actually forms the epiglottis. We need for it to be stretchy and return to its normal shape after it's done its job of capping off that opening. So epiglottis is formed of elastic cartilage.
But it looks pink and it has blood in it.
It does on the surface, yeah, but the actual internal structure is not just tissue that maybe like, say, dense fibers, it's actually elastic cartilage inside. Yeah. That's probably something like pseudo-stratified coating, something of that sort. I want to mention to you something on your worksheet called the Valsalva's maneuver. vocal cords can actually act to close off your air passageway. I don't mean to be gross here, but the next time you're taking a poop, think about the Valsalva maneuver, because that's what people do. In order to push things out of our bodies, whether it's a baby or whether it's poop, we actually close off the airway and we trap the air in our lungs. So what that does is it increases the pressure in our lungs. That pressure puts pressure in turn on the abdominopelvic cavity, and that actually helps to push things out. So if you notice that you're holding your breath, you're doing it by closing off those vocal cords, so they essentially slam shut like a clamshell and prevent air from leaving the lungs. So kind of an interesting thing there that happens when you hold your breath. I did want to draw your attention to the last line there about the Valsalva maneuver. Notice that this particular maneuver depresses the vagus nerve and it lowers the heart rate. If somebody has an instance of high heart rate or high blood pressure, they can actually hold their breath and lower their heart rate and lower their blood pressure. What if you do this for too long? What does your blood pressure eventually do?
You hold your breath until you're going to die.
There's two things. You'll pass out, but you'll wake back up and start breathing because your body's going to kick in the diaphragm and start pumping again. But in terms of blood pressure, this bottoms out your blood pressure. It lowers it dramatically. You probably heard that Elvis died on the toilet. Okay? If you're straining, this is horrible to talk about, isn't it? Here we are back to our favorite conversation with this poop. If you're straining for a long period of time, trying to produce a bowel movement, that vagus nerve is depressed, heart rate's depressed, and blood pressure is depressed. So if you hear about people dying on the toilet, it's not such a far-fetched, crazy thing. It's part of this Valsalva maneuver and holding one's breath to actually produce a bowel movement. So there you go. You know why Elvis died now. So
It sounds like a bad thing if you're lifting something heavy.
Because you can
Depress your heart rate.
Not only that, but you're increasing pressure in other parts of your body, so you may have capillaries that burst.
Yeah.
So yeah, in turn, it may be good for lowering heart rate if that's what you want to do, but bad for blood vessels. Yeah.
So you could pass out or die.
Right. Right. Crazy.
Never going to the bathroom
I'm
again.
not listening. Everybody should start taking laxatives now, right? How about questions so far? Okay, let's take you down into the chest cavity, the thoracic cavity.